Welcome, everyone. This is Allison French of Alto Solutions. I'm joining you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I am working with some clients to launch a great new leadership program, which is why I'm very sad to not be with you today in person at the International Conference and Expo out in Salt Lake City. But I am really honored, really thrilled to be able to join you via this technology to present It's Not You, It's Your Brain, Practical Neuroscience for Learning. So please enjoy the presentation. My contact information is in here. It's on the last slide and also on the worksheet that you can download from the ATD portal. Please feel free to contact me at any point with questions. And if you want to talk further about any of this, I always love to engage with all of you. So we're here today to really help you better understand why some of those more generic motivation and engagement strategies that you might have tried in the past can fall flat, and really to help you apply knowledge of how your brain works to better motivate, better engage your employees, your colleagues, your teams. And in turn, that can lead to more impactful training sessions and meetings. So today, I'm going to walk you through a couple of prominent brain models that can really help you to understand people that you work with and give you some better ideas and better ways to plan out how you can engage. So before we really jump in, I want to encourage you to go to the ATD portal, download the worksheet. It looks like this. You probably can't see it with my virtual background, but it's called It's Not You, It's Your Brain, Practical Neuroscience for Learning. It's short, it's about 4 pages, but what it really gives you is a way to capture your notes and your takeaways as we go through. And one thing that I've learned from brain science and I've experienced firsthand many times is that simple act of just jotting something down, writing something down, especially if physically done with pen and paper, that it sends a message to your brain that really solidifies the learning. So please take a moment now, pause the recording if you need to, print out the worksheet, or just grab a sheet of paper in a pinch so that you can record some takeaways as we go through today's session. And in particular, I want you to think about things you hear that may surprise you, things you hear that inspire you, and very importantly, how are you going to use this information in your job? So I want to start out by talking about what I call your plastic brain. And this is figuratively speaking, of course, but our brain is constantly changing to adapt to our experience. It possesses this remarkable capacity to reorganize pathways, create new connections, in some cases, even create new neurons, which is a concept called neuroplasticity, or put simply, brain plasticity. We also have something called mirror neurons, and these light up when we see other people do an intentional action, and that is something that's not random, something that we ascribe some sort of meaning to. There's a leading mirror neuron researcher based in Holland named Christian Kiesers, and he found that when we witness others' facial expressions, we activate the same emotions for ourselves, and that strongest emotion within a team can really ripple out to drive everyone to resonate with that same emotion without anyone consciously realizing it. So think about this for a moment. Think about this in your role as a trainer, as a leader. The strongest emotion within a team can ripple out to drive everyone to resonate with that same emotion without anyone consciously realizing it. So leaders and trainers like us, we really need to be aware of how they manage and they present their stress levels. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. The other thing I want you to know is that as threats and adverse life events increase, the brain actually temporarily shrinks. And what's interesting is that we go through lots of adverse, events in our life, and a physical adverse event, you stub your toe on the door jamb, for instance, physical pain, it creates an impact at the time it occurs, but it doesn't necessarily come back. You don't pass the door jamb and go, oh my gosh, that terrible door jamb, I hate it so much, and it creates this terrible feeling for you. However, social pain does. Social pain comes back whenever we are reminded of the event that initially triggered it. And this includes when we are in a state of overwhelm, or what I like to call, and what we've probably heard called before, constant firefighting. So since this is a workshop on essentially blaming your brain, let's talk a little bit about what it is that your brain actually does when it's on overload, which is something that we can all relate to. In her 2014 book, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, former Washington Post reporter Bridget Schulte cited a study by Yale researchers that used brain scanners on ordinarily healthy people who were in a state of overwhelm. And to understand what they found, we kind of need to take a step back in time first. So I want you to come back with me and picture for a moment that you are back in prehistoric times. And you see one of these guys on your screen, on the left side of your screen. And this is the saber-toothed tiger, and your brain is going to signal most likely one of two responses: your fight or your flight response. And probably you're not going to stop to really mull this over. You're just going to run. So why is it that our instinct kicks in like that? Well, it's actually due to the chemicals in our brain. So back in those days, the rational part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is right here in the front, it wasn't fully developed. And our ancient brains released a stress hormone called cortisol, which I'm sure you've heard of, and it creates that fight or flight or sometimes freeze response by releasing glucose into the bloodstream. And what that does is it shuts down unnecessary functions, and it gives our muscles the boost that they need to respond quickly in the most appropriate fashion. So flash forward to today, when every email that we get can sometimes feel like that saber-toothed tiger. And even though our prefrontal cortex has evolved since prehistoric times, it really only makes up about 4% of our brain volume, and it's really susceptible to the whims of that larger, older, stronger, more ancient part of the brain. So when we're triggered by a threat or we're in a state of overwhelm, the prefrontal cortex shuts down, and that ancient part of the brain called the amygdala kicks in and releases cortisol. So we're stressed, we're reactive, we start moving away emotionally, mentally, sometimes even physically, from what we perceive to be a threat, just like the saber-toothed tiger. But what specifically each one of us perceives as a threat is very unique and is related to our social experience. So that same email or other stressor that might trigger you may not have the same impact on someone else on your team. So think for a moment about what your saber-toothed tigers might be. And I want you to take that moment to use the worksheet or that sheet of paper and jot them down. It's really important to start with this piece of self-awareness before you can move on to fully understand how to motivate and engage with others. So pause the video for a moment, jot that down on your worksheet. Okay, so let's talk about stress. Is stress good? Is it bad? Well, the answer is both, sort of. There's an optimal stress curve, but when stress becomes a constant, that amygdala that causes the fight or flight response and shutting down, the shrinking that prefrontal cortex, that kicks in. This is called the amygdala hijack. And that's exactly what those Yale researchers found when Bridget Schulte mentioned it in her book. So this theory has been around since the early 1900s, when psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson performed experiments on mice. Basically, they used mild electric shocks, and they were able to teach the mice to learn a task, which they called a habit, more quickly. What they hypothesized was that as arousal increases, the ability to form a habit or perform a task well also increases. However, as the shock started to get stronger, the mice took longer to learn the task because they started to get more focused on avoiding the shock than on completing the task. So basically, once you surpass the top of this inverted U, or the optimal level of performance, then your performance begins to deteriorate, and you're simply too stressed, you're too anxious to do your best. So your brain starts to shut down, just like in the saber-toothed tiger example. And worse, it's not just your brain that suffers here. If you're consistently on that right side, that far right side of the curve, your body becomes bathed in that stress hormone cortisol. And the systems designed to protect your body start to turn against it. And this is what scientists call allostatic overload, which we now know significantly weakens our immune system, and it makes you more susceptible to all sorts of illness. So what is the optimal amount of stress? Well, Again, that kind of depends on you and it depends on the task. The simpler the task, the higher the additional arousal that is necessary. But a task that's maybe a little bit more challenging to begin with will require a lower level of arousal to reach the optimal point. So think about that for a moment. When you have a job or a meeting or a training event that's all about routine and nothing ever changes, that boredom sets in. There's no stress, but there's really also no motivation. So you're not being challenged and you don't really have an incentive to go above and beyond. And neither do the people in it with you. The work feels meaningless, so you tend to do the bare minimum. Whereas a moderate level of stress can go a long way. It's manageable, motivational, performance enhancing. Your heart starts to beat a little bit faster. The hormone adrenaline starts to kick in, and that increases your rate of blood circulation. You start to feel a sense of clarity and alertness, and you really get that extra little push that you need. So I want you to think about a time when this might have happened for you. And I know for me, this is the case almost every time I lead a training. I physically get a rush as I'm in the room, or to a lesser extent in the Zoom, and I'm figuring out on the fly how to weave in some of the unique personalities and the participant questions, and if I need to modify something on the fly. It's really interesting and really engaging to me, and I feel like I'm performing my best. Sometimes, though, it's just all too much. I remember distinctly a time when I ran a training class and just everything that could go wrong went wrong. And it quickly crossed that line from optimal stress and performance to, frankly, to crippling anxiety. Specifically, I was not only dealing with a very challenging situation in my personal life at the time, but when I arrived at the training site, I learned that there was no power. So my saber-toothed tigers were out in full force, and I could really physically feel myself shutting down. It was really only through some pretty serious self-awareness and self-talk combined with a lot of deep breathing that I was able to refocus and really get myself through the session. Was it my best training event ever? Far from it. But at that point, I kind of counted just getting through the day as a win. So think about where you typically find yourself on this curve in a typical day or in a typical week. And I want you to take another moment, pause the video if you need to jot it down on your worksheet. How often are you at the optimal level versus that far right side of the curve where the saber-toothed tigers are basically eating your lunch? Think about that for a moment. Jot down your ideas. Now I want to share with you a model that I particularly like that is one of several ways that I use to help diagnose those saber-toothed tigers and assist in determining strategies for motivation. It's called the SCARF model. It was developed in 2008 by neuroscientist David Rock, who you've probably heard of. I really, really encourage you to go to the the Neuro Leadership Institute website. I've got their link at the end of these slides and in the worksheet to really get more information on it if you're not already familiar. What I like about it is how simple, relatable, and observable it is. And I'm far from alone. HRCI, the premier human resources credentialing institution, has been using the SCARF model extensively over the last 5 years to help HR professionals shed new light on employee motivation. So in a nutshell, SCARF represents the 5 domains of social experience that your brain treats very similarly to survival issues. Much of our motivation driving social behavior is governed by an overarching organizing principle that we want to minimize threat and maximize reward. Sounds pretty simple, right? Back in 2007, the neuroscience researchers Lieberman and Eisenberger discovered that social needs are treated in very much the same way in your brain as the need for food and water. This dismantles Maslow's hierarchy a little bit, and it was one of the driving forces behind the development of this very model. So let's go through them one at a time. Status deals with a sense of personal worth and relative importance. That relativity is really critical here. Something like a really important sounding title can be very important and can matter a lot to someone who has this high status orientation. Certainty concerns being able to discern what the future holds. Someone who's high in this area and really needs to know what's going to happen next. They get really stressed out when things are unknown. And I've seen this happen a lot during the last 16 or 18 months during COVID because so much was unknown. I've got an 8-year-old son who has had a high certainty orientation pretty much for his whole life. And he has these sort of never-ending list of questions of what's next, what's next, what are we doing next, to the point where he'll come into my room on a Saturday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning and he'll say, what are we doing today? And, being a Saturday, I don't always know, but I'll make something up and I'll say, all right, well, I guess we'll get breakfast. And then I'll say, all right, well, then what? You have baseball practice. All right, well, then what? Well, then I guess we'll come home for lunch. Okay, well, then what? And it goes on and on. And he really feels the need to know everything in sequence. And if something changes, it's very unsettling. If that baseball practice gets rained out, he understands that things happen, but it's unsettling for him because now there's been a change and he doesn't know what's happening next. Autonomy provides a sense of control over events, the ability to do it ourselves. I see this a lot, my children as well. Someone who's very high in autonomy can be really uncomfortable when they don't have choices or when they perceive that they're being micromanaged in some way. Relatedness is a sense of connection and also safety with others. These folks really place a high value on being part of a group and building strong trust. And finally, fairness, as it sounds, is really this perception, again, of fair exchanges between individuals, and this idea that you can feel threatened when something is perceived as unfair in any sense of the word. I also have a 10-year-old daughter, and it's really interesting because when they were younger, we used to take a day off work and take them when they were in preschool. I used to take both my kids to a day off at an amusement park. And when I took my son, my daughter, of course, is 2 years older, and she was already in school. And she hit me up with, Mom, that's unfair. Why do I have to go to school? And he gets a day off. And I had to remind her that, well, 2 years ago, when you were in preschool, I took a day off and we went to the amusement park. But in that moment, that fairness threat kicked in for her. She really felt like he got something that she didn't, and she was really feeling threatened. So when we're feeling that threat, when we're high on a particular domain, we start to move away from things that threaten that area of our social experience. Again, a micromanager would feel like a threat to autonomy, for instance. Similarly, we more readily move toward things that reward that area. So, if you really like those fancy titles or public recognition to meet that status orientation, then you're going to feel rewarded if you get that. But again, not everybody is exactly the same in each area. And so we're going to look at each domain in a little bit more depth. And I'm going to bring you through a bit of a case study with some more concrete examples using some of the characters from one of my favorite TV shows from back in the 90s that I think illustrates these domains quite well. And the show is Friends. And as we go through these examples, I want you to think about what is motivating each of the characters and how you might apply that when working with people in your own organization or in your life. So let's talk again. We're going to start with status first. And it's important to remember that status, and in fact, all of these social experience dimensions, are really relative. And a high status orientation can explain things like phenomena in social media where somebody goes and queues up for hours on end to get a picture of themselves, a selfie with a celebrity, for instance, and post it on social media, just to kind of show everybody how great they are. And that may be unintentional, but it's this idea that, oh, wow, look at this cool thing that I'm doing that maybe you don't have. It's not intended to be mean in any way, but it's that status orientation, this idea of maybe one-upmanship. Can also explain sometimes when you see somebody who's worse off than you, that sometimes you get a little bit of a good feeling. Again, this is not a judgment, but there's a concept in German called Schadenfreude that explains that idea. Sometimes if you're speaking to someone who you perceive to have a higher status, that can activate a threat response. And it also can explain why being managed by someone who is perceived maybe not to have the same kind of experience as you, perhaps someone younger, could generate a status threat response. So there's a movie that comes to mind called In Good Company. It's a number of years old, and it starred Dennis Quaid and Topher Grace. And Dennis Quaid basically was this middle manager. He was working his way up the ladder. He was probably in his 50s at the time. He was really expecting a big promotion. And wouldn't you know it, the company went through a big merger, an acquisition. This other company came in with all these young hotshots, and Topher Grace, who was in his 20s, became Dennis Quaid's boss. Huge threat trigger for him in the status category, because he thought that, where is this guy coming from? He's young. He doesn't have the qualifications I do. Big threat. And then what got even worse, because Topher Grace's character started dating his daughter. So all sorts of threats going on here. Now, on the TV show Friends, if anybody remembers it, the character Monica really exhibits a very high status orientation. And I really love this episode where she finds out that something that she thought she was really good at, giving massages, she's actually really bad at. And her boyfriend, Chandler, tries to calm her down and says to her, "You don't need to be the best at everything, Monica." And she says, "You don't know me at all." And he says, okay. How's this? You give the best bad massages. If anyone was looking for the best bad massage, they'd have to go to you. And Monica says, "Oh, so you're saying there was an award for the best bad massage? Who would get that?" And he says, "Oh, it would be you. It would be you, Monica. You'd get all the votes." So he's really playing to her status need here. And then she thinks about it for a minute and she says, so maybe they could call the award the Monica. So you can see here that he really played to her status orientation. It's very easy to accidentally threaten a person's sense of status. In the workplace, this threat can occur through giving advice, through giving instructions. In fact, when someone is approached with that seemingly innocent phrase, "Can I offer you some feedback?" their brains enter fight or flight. And David Rock actually likened hearing this phrase to the reaction that you would have hearing fast footsteps behind you at night. Your heart rate quickens, you go into this reactionary mode almost immediately. And it really helps explain why performance reviews and things like corrective feedback can be pretty deadly. They generate a huge threat to status, and as a result can be ineffective at creating behavioral change. So a better solution could be to allow people to assess themselves and augment this with proactive positive feedback, which is shown to trigger the release of the hormone dopamine, which is the reward hormone in the brain. So let's talk now about certainty. And this is actually Chandler, who I mentioned before, who has a very analytical type job based in certainty. Each and every one of our brains are essentially pattern recognition machines. We're always trying to predict what's going to happen next. And the reason that we can perform some functions seemingly automatically is due to another region in our brain, the basal ganglia, that stores routine. Our brains really love the patterns that are created here. I think about music with very simple repeating patterns. It's really enjoyable because our brains are able to predict what's going to happen next. Sometimes maybe not enjoyable, sometimes just a catchy earworm. But it kind of triggers that feel-good hormone, dopamine, once again. On the flip side, when something alters our usual pattern, we start to feel stressed out. We sit up, we take notice. Back in the pre-COVID days, I remember, the way I would commute to my work and different clients, I kind of knew how to get to each place. And this can be hardwired as a habit. So that's why if you had a common path on your commute, whether you were taking a train or you were driving, you could listen to a podcast, or you could sing along to a favorite song, or you could even take a phone call while you were driving, for instance. But think about what happened when one of those streets was unexpectedly closed and the usual routine becomes untenable. So other parts of the brain need to kick in to deal with that threat of uncertainty. And you'll notice in situations such as these that you're no longer able to have a lucid phone conversation, or you might miss what was being said in the podcast and have to rewind it a little bit, because we need that rational part of the brain processing to help us navigate the uncertainty of the new route. So going back to Chandler for a minute, he has a difficult time sometimes with uncertainty in his life. He's this really analytical guy. He punches numbers, he crunches them, he runs report based on the numbers. It's very high in accuracy and certainty. And when things tend to veer off course, he hides behind sarcasm to cover his discomfort. So that may be something that you observe from people who, when they're feeling threatened by a lack of certainty, for instance. Anytime that there's a lack of clarity in expectations or timelines, objectives, positions, etc., any type of change, that threat reaction can occur. And in the work environment, the focus should be on transparent planning and clear communication to reduce uncertainty. Now, autonomy, with my friend Joey here, this is the perception of exerting control over one's environment, having choices, being able to do things your own way. And this is from another of my favorite episodes where Joey has purchased a bag that his friends are kind of making fun of. They're saying it looks like a purse. And for anybody who remembers this episode, he kind of gets very indignant and he says, you know what? You can make fun of it all you want. This is a great bag, and it's as handy as it is practical, and it's very becoming. And just because you don't understand something, it doesn't make it wrong. So from now on, you guys are going to get used to the fact that Joey comes with a bag, super adamant about it, super confident about it. It's a humorous example, cracks me up every time. But think about how somebody who's really high in autonomy and who loves this bag might feel if all of a sudden they're told that this is against company policy. You can't have that bag at work for some reason. It's against the company dress code. One of the biggest threats to autonomy in the workplace is the perception of being micromanaged in some way. So the key here is that it's really important to find ways to give choices, even if there really aren't very many choices. For example, I use this one with my kids all the time. They have to eat a vegetable at dinner. I actually don't really care what vegetable they eat. So I usually give them two choices, whatever it is I'm making for myself and my husband, and baby carrots. And I say, here's two options. You've got broccoli and you've got baby carrots. You pick, you eat whichever one you want. So, at the end of the day, they still have to eat a vegetable, but at least they have the choice of which of those options is preferable. Better than saying, you have to do it this way. You have to eat the broccoli, because then they're not going to do it. And this happens in the workplace as well. Here's two options that could work. Which way do you want to go versus here's how we have to do it. Now, relatedness is all about connection and belonging. In the workplace and elsewhere, this is observed sometimes by people getting into different groups. And it's also observed when people feel safe within the group. And they tend to avoid those who they could perceive as foes versus, no pun intended, friends. So without realizing it, whenever we encounter other people, whether this is at work or at a social gathering or out on the street, our brain starts to really unconsciously do a scan and categorize them as threatening or trustworthy. It's really human nature that most people just prefer to be with other people that they perceive as similar to them in some way, who will understand them and who will support them. On the other hand, when our brains perceive someone as a competitor, then that capacity to empathize drops pretty precipitously. So people who score really high in relatedness, they just have difficulty functioning without their group of people, so to speak. 10 years ago, neuroscientist John Cacioppo found that the need for safe human contact can be as much of a primary driver as food, and the absence of safe social interactions can generate a threat response. And we can sometimes call that feeling lonely, but it can also manifest itself in reduced trust. So the biological reason for this is that human connection, it releases the hormone oxytocin. That's the same hormone that's produced in pregnancy to help mothers bond with their children. And we can see this. So back in the pre-COVID days, we'd get together and discussion of something just as simple as, oh, the weather is terrible today, or, hey, did you see the score of that baseball game, that team that we both like? That can actually help release oxytocin, which builds positive emotions and in turn build trust with one another. We've had a slightly more difficult time over the last 16 or 18 months making those connections sometimes when we're just connecting electronically, which again is, I wish I could be there with you in person, but I'm hoping that as you're going through, you're seeing some of the connections that can be made. We are really designed to build groups that rely on mutual trust and work together against uncertainty. So we go back to that certainty idea as well here. There's a scene in the show Friends where Rachel, who you see in the hug, she finds out her dad is in the hospital, and she's going out to visit him out on Long Island, New York. She's saying that she doesn't need anybody to come with her. But you can tell from her body language that this is not the case. And Ross, pictured here, says, I'm gonna come out with you. You just can't be alone right now. And she says, no, I'm okay. I don't need you to come. I can totally handle this on my own. And as she's doing this, her face is falling and she starts to go in for a hug. So her body language is really showing this otherwise. And so he plays to this relatedness need and he says, even so, let me come for me. And this turns a corner for her and she says, okay, if you really need to. But she knows deep down that this relatedness need is being met and she's sort of being motivated by it, moving towards it. So you can really see this in her body language in the scene. In the workplace, things like networking, mentoring, coaching, small group learning, all of those things can play to that relatedness need that we have, that need for connection. The only caveat to keep in mind with small groups is to ensure diversity, to make sure that they're diverse enough so that we don't unintentionally create an us versus them sort of mentality. And last but not least, we have fairness. And there's a scene that comes to mind in the show where the character Phoebe, and she's not actually pictured here, she's about to meet her long-lost dad. She's approaching it pretty lightly, as the character Phoebe tends to do, but Ross, he really gets very up in arms about this. He's got a very strong sense of fairness, and he believes that Phoebe's dad has not treated her equitably. And he stands up in his seat and he says, aren't you angry at him? I mean, this guy abandoned you. I got to tell you, if it was me, this guy would be in some serious physical danger. I'd walk in there, I'd be like, yo, Dad. And he gets up and he gets really, really angry. You can see that he's feeling the sense of fairness for his friend. The interesting thing with fairness is, much like these other dimensions as well, especially status, is that it's based on perception. There was an experiment conducted at Carnegie Mellon University called the Ultimatum Game, and it was to gauge the perception of what's fair. In this experiment, participants were given either $10 or $20 by the researchers, Tabibnia and Liebman, and they were asked to share it with a colleague by giving the colleague $5. So in each case, the recipient got the same amount of money. However, the ones who received $5 out of 10 had a really positive reaction. But the ones who received $5 out of 20 had the reverse reaction. They actually reacted negatively because they perceived the division of the money was unfair. They only got $5 out of $20. They knew the other person had $20. Why were they only getting $5 and not splitting it evenly? There was a similar experiment where a reward of 50 cents out of $1 was actually viewed more favorably than a reward of $10 out of $50. Again, it's just that perception of I'm getting half versus I'm getting a fifth. That doesn't make sense. And this core idea is that fairness, like many other things, can really be in the mind of the beholder. So as such, fairness can be very, very difficult to tackle in the workplace because it's based on perception, and unfairness can be created pretty easily in a work environment, and its removal can be very difficult. So the best remedy for this is transparency. Being very clear in your communication, transparent, sharing what you can, when you can, to create that perception of fairness. So as you heard these stories, what did you learn about motivators? How do they differ from character to character? And how is this different from what you may have considered in the past? How did it relate to that optimal stress curve I shared with you before? Take a moment, pause the video, and jot down your ideas on the worksheet. Now that we know more about what's causing the overwhelm and overload at about those 5 domains of social experience that your brain treats the same as survival issues, you can really apply it in your personal and your professional life by understanding what it is that moves people away from us and what people perceive as a social threat, as well as what moves people towards us and what they perceive as a reward. We can start to craft strategies to onboard, support, motivate, and develop employees and leaders in our organizations. What's most important to note here is that one size does not fit all, which is why not all rewards work equally for everybody. Oftentimes, we can be very quick to suggest that a promotion or more responsibility or a different title or more flexible work schedule is going to be that appropriate carrot, so to speak. But in reality, that may not be the case. Someone who doesn't perceive as much of a threat to their status, but is very high in that relatedness need, might not be motivated by those things. So we need to be more attuned to what's going on inside our brains to then truly understand what will be the greatest motivator. So I encourage you to learn more about this by reading the books that I mentioned, Bridget Schulte, David Rock. They've got great books on these topics. Also, the Neuroleadership Institute has a summit coming up in November. What I've shared today only begins to scratch the surface, and I really highly recommend these excellent sources of information. Most important is to use what you know about your own brain to observe and diagnose the people that you encounter. You want to be a little bit of a detective on this. So what I've provided for you is a template in the workbook to help you with exactly this. So as a final exercise after this video, I want you to consider the people with whom you frequently interact. They could be employees, colleagues, team members, people that you train, whatever the case might be. Put their names down in the first column in the table. And then in the second column, think about the potential sources of overwhelm that might be causing them to remain on that far right side of the optimal stress or the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and or what domain might be particularly prominent for them in that SCARF model. What might trigger that prominent threat response or motivating response? Now that you've got all that information, you can use the final column to brainstorm how you can use what you've observed about them as motivators to drive them towards organizational goals. So as promised, here is my contact information. I'm truly hopeful that next year I can be with you in person to expand upon some of these brain-based ideas to motivate and engage. But in the meantime, please do not hesitate to contact me, reach out at any time. I would love to speak with you. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your conference.